Good afternoon. My name is Eric Wright. I'm the education specialist for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. I'd like to thank everybody for showing up for our book talk today with Mr. William Woolley. He's going to be talking about his newest work, Creating the Modern Army, Citizen Soldiers and the American Way of War, 1919 to 1939. But before we get started, I just have a couple notes that I want to make sure I get to real quick. First of all, I would like to say thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support. Without their support, we would not be able to put on all the free virtual programming that we do month in and month out. Not only our wonderful book talks, but also our trivia events, our drink and draw, our curators conversations, our movie nights, all the virtual events that we get to do are brought to you specifically by the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation. And I would like to say a big thank you to their sponsor, Generac Power Systems. Like I said, without those two organizations, we would not be able to put on all this free programming that we do. Also, I would like to let everybody know that we do have our security features enabled today, so nobody can turn on their camera or unmute themselves. So if you have any questions for our author today, please submit them as usual via the chat function here on Zoom. I will be taking those questions as they come through during the presentation. I'll be putting them into a PowerPoint, which I will display at the end of the presentation, and we'll get to all the questions. And then also, I would just like to say thank you to Mr. William Woolley for being with us today. William was born in Buenos Aires, Argentina, to American parents, and he grew up in Colorado. He received his bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College in 1959 with a major in international relations, and he went on to serve 4 years in the United States Navy. After he finished his enlistment, he attended Indiana University, where he completed his master's and doctorate degree, both in history. And in 1969, he began teaching at Ripon College, where he taught for 31 years. Wow, that's quite a career there, Bill. He offered courses in modern European history, Russian history, and American and European military history as well. And he also taught 2 summer American military history workshops at West Point. He's published several articles during his career, and his newest work, Creating the Modern Army, Citizen Soldiers and the American Way of War, will be released by the University Press of Kansas very shortly. William, welcome to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum today.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to go ahead and turn the platform over to you. All of our audience members did not show up to hear me talk. They hear that enough. They came to hear you speak today. So I'm going to turn the platform over to you. The floor is yours, sir. And like I said, I'll be taking questions via chat. And formulating it into a PowerPoint, and we'll bring those up at the very end. Bill, it's all yours.
Okay. I want to thank Peter Kolakowski and Eric for inviting me to speak today. I can't get this into the narrow. We're already having some technical difficulties, but we can play with that while I'm talking. In case I want to thank you. Okay.
Is it working?
Yeah.
Okay, all I'm doing is using the mouse.
Okay. I want to thank Peter and Eric for allowing me to speak to you today, even if we're only virtually.
Oops.
My book, Creating the Modern Army, Citizen Soldiers and the American Way of War, 1919-1939, deals with what many consider to be possibly the least interesting period in the history of the American Army. Most histories of the Army treat the period hurriedly as they rush to move from one war to the next. And most armies, and it's easy to see why the period is seen as uninteresting. The Army seems to have done little or changed little. This lack of change stands in dramatic contrast to the other services. The Navy in this period moved from battleships exchanging broadside gunfire to a form of combat dominated by naval aviation. The Marines developed a new mission of amphibious warfare. The new air service totally invented itself as a new form of warfare. Compared to this, the Army seems to have changed little beyond experimenting with the new divisional structure and toying with tanks in the late 1930s. Military historians noting this seeming lack of change, have often blamed it on what they see as conservative inertia dominating the Army in this period. And indeed, my book started out as an effort to understand why the Army was so conservative. However, as I got into research, a far more mixed picture began to appear, with the efforts to preserve a traditional military culture coexisting with contrasting interest in near revolutionary forms of ground warfare. Moreover, I found that major cultural and political forces inhibited the Army's efforts to modernize itself. And finally, and most important, military historians and others tend to measure change in terms of tangibles, such as weapons or doctrinal development, while major organizational developments often get ignored. Thus, historians sometimes miss the fact that in the interwar period, the American Army underwent an almost revolutionary organizational transformation from a professional cadre army augmented in wartime by hastily trained conscripts to a citizen army, the heart of which was self-trained citizen components. In addition, in this period, the regular army was modernized by making the branch rather than the regiment the chief organizational element, and also began to respond to the impact of the Industrial Revolution on warfare. In short, during the interwar period, the Army, which only a few decades earlier had still been a frontier constabulary force, had become the basis of the modern Army we have today. In my book, I offer at least a sketch of how this took place. However, while the interwar Army may have been a small one, it was still a complex organization with a multitude of parts, so that anything like an encyclopedic coverage of all the elements in the Army would have been a massive undertaking. As a result, I have limited my story to those elements of the Army that best illustrate the process of change taking place. This includes the development of the citizen army, the development of the four main combat branches of the Army: infantry, cavalry, field artillery, coast artillery, the development of the professional military educational system, and the response of infantry and cavalry to the challenges created by the rise of mechanized warfare. I then placed all of this in the context of cultural and political environment of the time, since that environment played such a crucial role in the development of the Army. I'm not going to try to cover all that today, but I'm only going to deal with three aspects of it: the development of the citizen army, a comparison of how three of the combat branches dealt with change, and finally, the impact of the cultural and political climate on the Army's development. And I'm actually going to begin with the latter, because the cultural and political climate of this period had a major impact on all aspects of the Army's activities. Regarding the cultural environment, America has long had a significant anti-military streak in its culture. The Constitution contains a number of provisions hedging the Army that were put in there out of fear that it could become an agent of tyranny. Moreover, early Americans saw little need for a standing army, since the country was already protected by two oceans as moats, and it already hosted two alternative forms of military force that largely met its defense needs. The first of these two was the militias, made up of self-trained volunteers who provided local communities with security from Native Americans and from social unrest. The occasional needs for a national military forces were then almost entirely met by the other alternative, which was ad hoc volunteer units recruited in time of war by local notables, a number of whom had probably received the rudiments of military training at places such as Norwich College in Vermont. Such volunteer units played a major role in the war with Mexico and supplied nearly all the forces in both sides of the Civil War. And while the volunteers disappeared in the 20th century, the militias survived as the National Guard, which had its own ambitions as being a national defense force. In the 1920s, these traditional negative attitudes were strongly flavored by the fact that many Americans took seriously the promise that World War I was the, quote, war to end wars, and looked to disarmament and to treaties renouncing the use of force as the proper basis for American security. In the 1930s, this was reinforced by a widespread belief that American participation in the earlier World War had been a mistake that was to be avoided in the future. In the late 1930s, Congress passed Neutrality Bills almost annually. Seeing the Army as a reminder of World War I, the attitude of American public opinion toward it all during this period ranged from indifferent to antipathetic. For Army officers, this was demoralizing. Officers in the post-World War I Army strongly desired to be valued and respected for their service and for their professional expertise, and were demoralized by the public attitudes they saw. In the early 1920s, articles appeared in the service journals that sought to explain negative attitudes as being the product of deliberate communist subversion and pacifist propaganda, or the result of poor public relations on the part of the War Department. These articles later disappeared as officers finally and unhappily accepted the fact of the Army's lack of public support. Public antipathy toward the Army then reinforced the problems that we faced in regard to the government. While America was governed by Republicans in the 1920s and Democrats in the 1930s, neither proved to be a friend of the Army. Despite their differences, both parties favored policies reducing the federal budget. Republicans in the 1920s sought to reduce the budget to stimulate the economy by cutting taxes. Democrats in the 1930s sought to reduce the budget to fight the Depression. Thus, all during the interwar period, the Army was seriously underfunded in terms of carrying out the national military policy that it was assigned. That policy, as embodied in the National Defense Act of 1920, called for a regular army of 280,000 officers and men. However, no sooner was the National Defense Act signed into law than Congress passed an appropriations bill limiting the Army to only 175,000. More reductions followed until by the end of 1922, the regular Army had been reduced from 280,000 to 125,000 men and officers. And it remained that size until late in the 1930s, making it the 18th largest army in the world, just slightly smaller than the Army of Romania. Other elements in the Army's budget were drastically reduced as well. As a result, the Army was seriously underfunded and understaffed in terms of carrying out the mission assigned in the National Defense Act of 1920. More important, while underfunding was not the only force that impeded the development of mechanization of the Army, it was the most important contributor. Both the infantry and cavalry began demanding or asking for tanks in the late 1920s, but it was not until 1935, when war in both Europe and Asia was becoming a real threat, and both European powers and Japan were already well along in the process of developing major mechanized forces, that the Army finally began to get tanks in any significant numbers. So overall, the officers in the Army in the interwar period saw themselves as underfunded, overworked, and unappreciated, while their efforts to modernize the force were hamstrung by severe budget limitations. So much for the environment. The major issue in my book is the creation and development of the citizen army, and I'd like to turn to that issue. The citizen army was a curious and unique creation. It was the end product of a reform project in the army that began nearly a half century earlier. Beginning in the early 1870s, a tiny but slowly growing group of officers, inspired by the writings of Major Emory Upton, who was as close as America has ever come to having a military genius, sought to reform the American army, transforming it from a frontier constabulary force to a small but modern European-style army. By the early years of the 20th century, these reformers had made significant progress. However, one major aspect of their reform program seemed absolutely unobtainable, and that was the creation of a trained reserve force that could be called up in case of war. European armies created these forces by conscripting men in peacetime to serve with the regular army for 2 or 3 years. They would then, as fully trained soldiers, return to civilian life, but for 10 to 12 years, they would be obligated, in case of war, to report to a designated reserve unit. American military reformers made small efforts to create a similar reserve systems, only to be blocked by American public opinion, still very much influenced by traditional anti-militarism, as well as by charges that establishing a reserve system such as that would, quote, Prussianize American society. But in 1912, another American military intellectual, Captain John Macaulay Palmer, came up with an alternative form of reserve system based not on European models, but on the American tradition of the volunteer soldier. His solution was a citizen army staffed by officers who had, like their 19th century officers in the volunteer forces, trained themselves and volunteer soldiers. However, rather than serving in ad hoc organizations, as did the 19th century volunteers, the officers and men in the citizen army would be assigned billets in units of a large army, which in peacetime existed only on paper, but would become a real army in time of war. However, Palmer pointed out that to make this work, the soldiers in the force would have to have had significant prior military training during peacetime, a major problem for which he had no solution. 2 years later, however, a solution to that problem began to appear. American elites then were growing concerned with the impact of rapid urbanization on the new generations of American males. Males growing up on the small farms of the rural society of 19th century America could be counted on to possess strong bodies toughened by hard outdoor farm work. They also lived in small towns with populations that were ethnically homogeneous and dominated by church and family. So by growing up there, they could be counted on to be patriotic and respectful of order. The tenements of the cities, on the other hand, were seen as producing scrawny, flabby weaklings, susceptible to the influences of the immigrants flooding into the cities and to the influence of radical labor and other movements. It was this concern, for instance, that led to the establishment of physical education as part of school curriculum. For the elites, however, the best answer to the problem was thought to be a program of universal military training, or UMT. A year or two of training with the Army, it was thought, would not only do wonders for the teenage male's physique, but would improve Americanization and respect for traditional order. By 1915, the UMT movement was strongly reinforced by a near panic in American society that America was unprepared in the event that the Titanic war going on in Europe would spill over into the United States, and a major preparedness movement was underway. The institution of UMT was linked as part of preparedness. While the Army did not formally support the UMT movement, it was delighted to see it, and many officers supported it, including Palmer. In mid-1916, Congress passed an Army organization bill which, among other things, provided for the creation of a Reserve Officers Training Corps, or ROTC. With this, all the pieces necessary for creating a citizen army with officers trained in ROTC and soldiers trained in UMT seemed to be ready to fall into place. By late 1916, the General Staff began working on a comprehensive military organization proposal to the Congress based on this citizen army concept. By February of 1917, the staff was all but ready to present its proposal to Congress when the sudden deterioration of relations with Germany made war imminent, and the momentum behind creating a military system based on UMT was lost, as all attention was directed to preparing for the war. At the end of the war, there was an opportunity to take advantage of the momentary popularity of the Army, which had just won the war, to get the public and Congress to accept a new Army organization. In early January of 1919, the Chief of Staff at the time, Major General Peyton March, called on the General Staff to propose draft legislation that could be introduced into Congress as soon as possible. The staff sought to propose the idea of a citizen army trained by UMT, but found it complex and could not respond immediately. March, therefore, drafted his own plan based on a professional army of 500,000 men that could be augmented in time by conscription. He was, however, too late. Congress adjourned for the summer, and before his plan could be taken up. By the time Congress reconvened in the fall, the popularity of the Army had rapidly faded, and March's proposal of a professional army of 500,000 men was an absolute non-starter in Congress. Congress instead began writing its own Army reorganization legislation. In doing so, the Senate called on Palmer, now a colonel, for advice, and he presented them with an alternative to March's plan involving a far smaller regular army backed by a reserve force made up of a citizen army with officers trained in the ROTC and soldiers trained by UMT. The senators were delighted with the idea, since it was far cheaper than the March plan and seemed to be so truly American in its character. Palmer and several other Army officers were given the freedom by Congress to write up a bill for the desired comprehensive reorganization of the Army. But this took time, and time was running out. Public enthusiasm for UMT began to diminish, and finally that program had to be dropped from the proposed bill. Congress then finally passed a compromise bill, now labeled the National Defense Act of 1920, and was signed by the President in June 4th, 1920. It was a major disappointment for the reformers and others in the Army, some of whom saw the absence of UMT as a fatal flaw in the emerging citizen soldier force. Nevertheless, the Army accepted the act as written, and for the next 20 years sought to make a success of the citizen army concept. According to the National Defense Act, American security was to be provided by a national army composed of a regular army of 280,000 men and officers and 4 citizen components: the National Guard, the Reserve Officers Training Corps, the Citizens Military Training Corps camps, and finally, an organized reserve which was to be made up of an officers' reserve corps, but had no reserve soldier component. In other words, all chiefs and no Indians. In this plan, the regular army would be responsible in peacetime for supervising the training of the citizen components and for minor operations. It would then act as a first line of defense in a major war. The National Guard, once federalized, would serve as a second line of defense. And in a truly major war, the officers in the Officer Reserve Corps would be mobilized and would then train and lead a huge reserve army made up of conscripts. The main attraction of the citizen army was that the citizen components would largely train themselves. The National Guard would train in its weekly drills, and the officers in the Officers Reserve Corps would train largely by completing correspondence courses. However, regular Army officers were also assigned to assist units in this, and especially to run the all-important summer training camps. Although up to half the officer strength of the regular Army was involved in these camps, due to the reduced size of the officer corps, they were thinly staffed, and the training of the civilian components was generally not as well supported as it could have been. Overall, the Army's effort to create a citizen army met with, at best, only limited success. The ROTC program was quite successful, in part due to the support it got from the host colleges. But due to limitations in funding and available Army officers, it could produce only a half of the reserve officers needed to fulfill the program provided in the National Defense Act. The Army successfully reestablished the National Guard after World War I, and afterwards, the Guard tended to see improvements year after year in its training program. However, although the Defense Act called for a Guard strength of 450,000 men and officers, appropriations provided for no more than 190,000 for most of the interwar period. This meant that many Guard units were severely under strength and would not have been combat ready until heavily reinforced by conscripts who would then need to be trained. Moreover, the 48-hour weekly drills, along with summer camps, were scarcely sufficient to fully train, fully ready combat soldiers. And finally, many senior Guard officers were so focused on training their units that they had little time or opportunity to train themselves. However, it was the Officers Reserve Corps that was the truly weak link in the program. In theory, the officers in the program were to mobilize, train, and then lead the men in 27 divisions, and they were to do it without the aid of non-commissioned officers. This would have been a daunting task even for professional officers, but the officers in the Officers Reserve Corps were scarcely professional. Their training was limited to what they learned in the ROTC program and theoretically augmented by participation every 3 years in 2-week summer camps. But the funding for those camps was so drastically reduced that many never got to camp at all. Otherwise, the reserve officer was to train himself for participation in correspondence courses, which did almost nothing in terms of teaching leadership. As a result, neither the Guard nor the Officers Reserve Corps were prepared to meet the needs of World War II when it came. American mobilization for the war began in late 1939 and had to be carried out piecemeal by the regular Army rather than by the Officers Reserve Corps. Maneuvers during this period exposed deficiencies in the National Guard training, and a not large number of National Guard senior officers were relieved of their commands. At the same time, it was abundantly clear that the officers in the Officers Reserve Corps were not in any way able to carry out the training program assigned to them in the National Defense Act. Still, by the time the United States actually went to war, its strenuous efforts to recruit the Guard to full strength and train it meant that it did provide 18 of the 29 divisions so far mobilized, while the Officers Reserve Corps had at least provided the Army with over 100,000 partially trained officers, which greatly aided and speeded up mobilization. The other major aspect of my book is how the combat branches responded to the challenge of change. And in the interest of brevity, I'm going to only look at three, which I think illustrate the differences between them. First, however, one of the most important changes in the Army in the interwar period was that the branch replaced the regiment as the main organizational element in the Army. In the 19th century, the regiment was the basic structural element in the Army, and the War Department operated the Army largely through orders to regiments. By the 20th century, this was breaking down, and the branch was emerging as the chief organizational element of the Army. This process was completed as the National Defense Act authorized the creation of the Office of Chief of Branch for each of the four branches, and the formal branch structure was created. The branches supported the professional schools for officers in the branch. They were responsible for supervising the development and evaluation of weapons technology and tactical doctrine related to the branch, and they handled all officer assignments. Moreover, the branch developed a culture that aided officers in developing a sense of their professional identity. Among the four combat branches, the field artillery was clearly the most static. In most regards, it entered World War II with basically the same weapons used at the end of World War I. There was early on brief conflict within the branch regarding basic tactical doctrine, but this was settled by fiat by the highly charismatic and dictatorial Chief of Field Artillery, Major William Snow. In the 1930s, there was an accelerated move to substitute automotive traction for animal traction of weapons. Otherwise, there was little change. And there were three major causes for this stability. First, the branch had no incentive to change. By the end of World War I, the field artillery and infantry team was recognized as the primary combat entity in the Army. And if infantry was the queen of battles, field artillery was the king. Hence, its mission and importance to the Army was validated, precluding any incentive for change. Second, while field artillery officers could see ways of tweaking the weapons they used in the war, they saw no imperatives to change them. And third, regardless of what those officers might have thought, Congress was aware that field artillery had ended the war with a huge supply of surplus weapons that seemed to preclude any need to invest in developing new ones. On the other hand, the most innovative and flexible of the branches was the coast artillery. The coast artillery had been the premier service in the Army in the 19th century. America's defense strategy then was based on large forts, such as Fort Sumter, which guarded the major ports in America under the assumption that any foreign invasion would first have to capture a port. By the late 19th century, coast artillerymen had developed a high degree of skill in directing the fire of heavy guns at distant targets, and they were highly valued for that. By the end of the 19th century, 2 out of every 7 servicemen in the Army were in the coast artillery, which was the only branch to have its own office in the War Department. World War I, however, was a disaster for the service. The big forts saw no action. Coast artillery men instead manned field artillery, heavy field artillery. Moreover, the new 16-inch guns that were beginning to be mounted on battleships and could be fired from positions that were out of sight beyond the horizon doomed the forts. As a result, the Coast Artillery Service faced a crisis of having no mission to justify its existence. All during the 1920s, it floundered without success, looking for ways its expertise in handling big guns could be made part of a military program that would justify its existence. However, during the war, Coast artillerymen had also been responsible for anti-aircraft defense of military units. After the war, a small anti-aircraft service was created within the branch and began to develop the weapons and technology needed to shoot down moving airplanes. The process continued until by 1930, all coastal artillery officers were required to become proficient in anti-aircraft warfare as a signal that service in anti-aircraft defense was emerging as the Corps' central mission. In the 1930s, this focus of attention in the branch shifted from providing air defense for military units to providing air defense for cities, as air forces were shifting their attention to strategic warfare. By the end of the 1930s, Coast Artillery had almost totally transformed itself into the anti-aircraft service, and the old name disappeared. Overall, it was the mission crisis emerging from the experience of the World War that drove Coast Artillery to almost entirely reinvent itself as the anti-aircraft service. The field artillery, experiencing no such mission crisis, remained static during the interwar period. This brings us to the cavalry. To me, the cavalry's efforts to deal with the challenges of modernization in the interwar period are the most interesting of those of the four combat branches, since they were also part of the development of concerns of the overall Army leadership about how warfare was to be conducted in the future. Like the Coast Artillery, cavalry was a loser in the World War. By 1917, it was clear that the Western Front was no place for, forgot the cavalry now. Western Front was no place for a horse, and only one cavalry regiment was even sent to France. So, after the war, like the Coast Artillery, cavalry had to find a mission to justify its continued existence. The direction it headed was to suggest new ways of warfare. There was much dissatisfaction among military leaders with World War I, which was seen as a uselessly bloody and indecisive form of warfare. And many thought the answer was to find a way to restore mobility to warfare. The cavalry tried to deal with that. They created a unit called the 1st Cavalry Division in Texas as a kind of laboratory. During the early 1920s, the 1st Division experimented with a number of ideas about restoring mobility to warfare, but none seemed promising. However, there was also another answer to the problem posed by the nature of World War I, which was to restore decisiveness to combat, which would require the development of a special type of cavalry. In the past, there have generally been 3 types of cavalry: light cavalry that engages in raids, reconnaissance, dragoons or mounted infantry, and heavy cavalry, a descendant of the medieval knight and was a shock weapon designed to produce decision in battle. All during the 19th century, American horse soldiers were formed as light cavalry. But at the beginning of the 20th century, as cavalry's mission of policing the settlement of the West was coming to an end, cavalry began reforming itself along French lines as heavy cavalry. After the war, this continued based on the fact that a horse could traverse no man's land far faster than a human, thought was given as to how a cavalry assault could restore decisiveness to combat. However, barbed wire and the machine gun seemed to preclude an answer. Then came the tank. Tanks appeared toward the end of World War I. Allies generally used two tanks, the 6-ton French Renault light tank and the 40-ton British Mark 8 heavy tank. Both moved at only 6 miles an hour, so that they were considered only as an infantry support weapon. But a breakthrough came in 1927 with the development of the T1E1, a tank that could travel at 20 miles an hour. And this fast tank began to change everything. A significant schism began to develop within the Army regarding the entire concept of change, not only change within armies, but changes within warfare itself. In regard to the issue of change, most American Army officers tended to be empirical evolutionists. They felt that there were central aspects of war that were unchanging over time, although they might change over time in the way they manifested themselves. In that framework, only those changes that were built incrementally on existing traditions were legitimate, and only those if they were the product of experience. On the other hand, there was a significant minority of officers who might be called visionary revolutionaries, who could envision revolutionary paradigm shifts in the conduct of warfare. The followers of Giulio Douhet, the Italian, who claimed that terror bombing of cities could end wars without the need to mobilize armies at all, were an extreme example of this. Within a short time, the appearance of the new fast tank led some more revolutionary officers in the general staff to envision replacing the existing mass armies of conscripted infantry that gave World War I its bloody and indecisive character with small, highly mobile armored units manned by professionals as a means to restore mobility, economy, and decisiveness to warfare. The entire vision was encapsulated in a concept called the mechanized force. The mechanized force was to be a combined arms unit, all elements of which, infantry, artillery, the rest, was to be mechanized. It was seen by some as a revolutionary new form of ground warfare that would do away with the existing branches, such as infantry and cavalry, which were seen as being too tied to their traditions to be able to change. In 1928, the General Staff had a unit called the Experimental Mechanized Force assembled to test the ideas along this line. After several months of trial, the decision was made to create an actual mechanized force. Due to time lags in the budget process, however, that mechanized force did not appear until 1930. By then, both the infantry and cavalry had come to oppose it out of fear that it would get control of tanks and end the branch's own efforts to mechanize, and the mechanized force was dissolved. But the idea did not die. At the same time, the cavalry seized on the new fast tank as a means of making traditional cavalry units far more effective to the point that they could bring decision to warfare. One approach to this was based on the light cavalry tradition and stressed mobility. It was pushed by Adna Chaffee, who was a leading exponent of mechanization in the Army in the 1930s. He saw mechanized cavalry as hard-hitting, mobile units that could operate on the flanks and even in the enemy rear. On the other hand, the generals who headed the Chief of Cavalry Office in the 1920s and all during the 1930s, sought to develop mechanized cavalry in tanks as a heavy cavalry type shock force that could bring decision to the battlefield by breaking through enemy lines. Both sides, however, agreed that the necessary mechanization required replacing horses in cavalry with the tank. Moreover, they were aware that the dream of revolutionizing warfare by means of a combined arms mechanized force had not died. It continued to have supporters in the general staff who were ready to reintroduce it should the mechanization efforts of the cavalry and infantry prove too slow in light of the deteriorating international situation in the late 1930s. Hence, cavalry had to make the transition from horse to tank as rapidly as possible. But there was a major limitation on how fast cavalry could change, and that was that the horse was central to the traditions and the culture that defined cavalry and made it a cohesive organization. Thus, cavalry was finally unable to move fast enough to suit the general staff, and in 1940, the staff opted for the visionary dream and created a new combined arms unit, now called the Armored Force, a unit that gradually morphed into the Armored Division. While in 1942, cavalry as a branch was dissolved. Despite this, however, the evolution of the anti-tank weapons again restored the balance between offense and defense in the war. And by 1943, even in the wide open plains of Russia, warfare again bogged down into a slugging match, and the armored divisions in the American Army came to be used largely as cavalry had foreseen in the 1930s as shock units operating in the tradition of heavy cavalry. And finally, in conclusion, in 1919 and 1920, Americans had the first and only opportunity in their history since the writing of the Constitution to choose how their nation was to be defended. And they could have chosen the proposal offered by the Chief of Staff, Peyton March, of a large professional army of 500,000 men, or they could have chosen the citizen army proposed by Palmer. From a strictly military point of view, the March proposal was rather clearly the better one, but it clashed with American traditions and values. And as Palmer stated in 1912, the practical military statesman does not propose impractical or foreign institutions, but seeks to develop the necessary vigor and energy with the familiar institutions that have grown up with national life. Armies, after all, are both the products and reflections of the societies that create them. So despite its many deficiencies, it was a distinctly American citizen army that fought and won World War II, thereby validating itself as the American way of war. Thank you.
Bill, I don't think I've ever heard this period of Army history so succinctly put. In 45 minutes, roughly, you wrapped up almost 30 years of development, not only in technology, but in philosophy as well. That was superb, sir. That's superb.
Thank you very much, Eric.
And we've got a lot of comments from our audience members as well, basically saying the same thing. And we have quite a few questions also, and we'll jump right into those. Just give me a second here.
And you'll have to explain to me how I'm to respond to them.
Just as you would any other question, just shout it out, shout the answer out.
Okay.
We'll see the questions, yeah, we'll reply to them verbally. And the first one says, if I could just get rid of most of my stuff. At the beginning of your talk, you used the term conservative inertia, talking about the philosophy at the time. Can you please explain a little bit about this concept, conservative inertia, and what you might?
It wasn't necessarily, I suspect there's sort of a redundant phrase. I suppose all inertia is conservative. But it was just it just meant that that the army was conservative, and there was a kind of an inertia governing its functions.
Okay. Let's see if we move on to the next question here. Also, can you please explain what you meant by the use of the term Prussianized when you were talking about the American Reserve Forces at the beginning of your talk?
Okay, good. That when I said the reformers were going to use European models, they were using the German model. The Germans had been extraordinarily successful in the 19th century in their warfare because they had a far superior military system. So that was the one the Americans chose to copy. You can see this at the Army War College, which has a statue of Frederick the Great in front of it. So yes, it was going to Prussianize it, but Prussia, in a certain sense, being a term that it depicted for Americans militarism.
Okay. Let's see here. We'll go to the next question. Why was the U.S. Army not supportive of the UMT movement? You would think that that's something that they would be willing to rally around.
Not formally supportive, but they, in other words, they made no specific efforts in Congress to introduce the idea. They were ready to do so, and would do so if they thought it had sufficient political support to be successful. So they were testing the waters, and they did occasionally have some plans, some draft bills ready to introduce if it seemed like it could fly.
Okay. During this period as well, who was responsible for funding the ROTC movements that were going on across the nation? Was that the colleges themselves, or was that partially sponsored by the government? And how did that work?
Both. The governments provided personnel, usually in terms of a professor of military science and tactics, and perhaps other personnel and even clerical personnel. It provided the equipment, textbooks, and so forth. The colleges were supposed to provide the faculty, which was a bit difficult because at this time there was no such thing as a elective, and professors had to adapt their courses so they could fit the needs of the Army. But so in any case, the Army supplied the officers, the equipment, the colleges provided the faculty and the classrooms and so forth.
All right. Another question we got from one of our audience members is why do you label Emory Upton as a military genius? What in your mind sets him apart from other military thinkers at this time?
One, I say he was close to a genius. No, his interests were far-reaching. He devised a whole new tactic after the Civil War. He devised a whole new tactical system. But I guess I would say this: he looked back on the Civil War and said, "My God, what a waste! What can we do to prevent anything like that from ever happening again?" So he was probably the only person in America initially who began to think of the war as a whole and how to deal with it. And he got the Secretary of War to send him to Asia and to Europe and to including Germany, so that he could study and he try to come up with a system that would make warfare far more decisive and less costly and bloody, as was the Civil War. But his interests spread widely, and I think he's the only person who probably had a comprehensive view, which others then began to adopt.
I can imagine only imagine what he thought after the results of World War I as well, seeing the same thing just happened, basically happening all over again.
Yeah,
just a waste of human life.
Yeah, there was. I remember hearing that Patton who spoke French, was talking to some French officers, said something, and the French officer said, "I don't know what this is, but it isn't war."
Next question, Bill. What is your opinion of Douglas MacArthur and George Marshall's contributions to making the citizen army concepts work?
Okay. Douglas MacArthur was chief of staff in 1930, and it was he who abolished the mechanized force. But he strongly endorsed mechanizing the branches. So most of his contributions would be there. He made some efforts to try to give life to the reserve officer training, the reserve officers program. But all they could do was come up with dibs and dabs of changes that could be made, given the lack of funding. So he was interested in how they could change the availability of summer camps that might provide for at least a small core of reserve officers who would be better trained than the others and would be available for immediate service. I guess overall, he and his successors were beginning to become more interested in creating smaller, more effective forces, and were less interested, in some respects, less interested in the mass army concept that was part of the citizen army. For Marshall, he only became chief of staff late. He defended the citizen army, and he was had part of his career. He was actually worked with a National Guard unit, and so I think he very much supported that. But he was not chief of staff until after 1939.
Okay. I think we have a couple more questions here. How does the Army, American Army development during this period, how does it compare with other World War I belligerent countries during this period, such as France and Germany and England? Were they all kind of developing along similar lines, or were there drastic disparities in philosophy and implementation, I suppose?
Most of them were much farther ahead of the U.S. in terms of mechanization, and were experimenting with mechanization. Than we were, most of them following basically similar lines. For most of the 30s, the concept of mechanization was heavily based on mobility, with light tanks being able to move fast. By the end of the decade, after the Spanish Civil War, it became rather clear that the light tanks they were using, which were still 5 and 6 tons in weight, so they could be carried on a commercial truck, were too light and too vulnerable to the anti-tank warfare. And there was beginning to be a shift to the medium tank, which then proceeded in the 40s. And with that, a greater move to the tank as a shock weapon. But largely, France, Italy, Germany, Russia were largely well ahead of us in terms of mechanization.
And I think there is one more question, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, no, sorry, that was it. Yeah, that was it.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Oh, no, actually, there is one more question, Bill. I know you have had a couple, they've kind of put the publishing date off on your book a couple times. When can we expect to see that? That's the $1 million question, right?
The initial date was March 4th. And And publisher and I have been in contact, and I have been given several times given dates that weren't met. The latest promise is sometime before the end of the month.
Okay.
The statement was, I think, our fingers are crossed that we will have it available in 7 to 10 days. Fingers are crossed, of course, of the contingent. I don't know what's holding things up, but it may be the same problems that are holding everything else up.
It very well could be supply chain issues and whatnot.
Right.
But I know I could probably speak for at least a good majority of our audience today and myself and several of the staff members here at the museum. We are certainly looking forward to that book coming out. I myself am looking forward to diving into it. As I was listening to your presentation and being a former Army sergeant myself, I have many questions, not only about armor, but as well as the development of the non-commissioned officer portion of that. So I'd love to be able to read about that. So if you could let us know, or at least send me an email when that does come out officially, and then I can contact all of our audience members and let them know as well. Yeah, we're definitely looking forward to that book coming out, Bill. That looks like a good piece of work right there.
Okay, one last question. I see on my list in front of me several very familiar names of former students. I don't know
I thought they were.
I thought I'm very, 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 very pleased that I had a chance to present this to them, and whatever efforts you made in that regard are very, very much appreciated. Thank you.
Oh, no, you're more than welcome, Bill, and thank you for being with us today. We thoroughly enjoyed your presentation, and like I said, we can't wait for that book to come out so we could dive right into that. I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon, and if you just want to hang on and not take off real quick, I'd like to thank everybody else for showing up today and joining us for this lunchtime presentation. Fantastic work by Professor William Woolley. And like I said, we're definitely looking forward to his book coming out. You can find all the rest of our events for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum at our website, wisvetsmuseum.com/events. Like I said, not only do we do our book talks, but we do curator conversations where we feature different staff members speaking about different topics on military history and museum work as well. Our trivia nights, our movie discussion nights, our drink and draw events, and all the other virtual events that we do. So you can find those listed on our website. And we hope to see many of you come back for some of our other events. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. If you're here in the southern Wisconsin, Madison area, it is a beautiful one. And if you are not, well, I hope it's just as nice where you're at as well. We'll see everybody next time, and I hope everyone has a great day.